much, Phil, for coming onto the Source newsletter. I really appreciate you. And anybody who knows news, who knows Black news, knows you. And if they don't know you, they don't know what's going on.
I appreciate that.
No, honestly and truly, like you are on the pulse of everything that's happening, not only mainly Black news, but news in general, to be honest. You tell people what's going on. You are one of the most trusted journalists of our time, and you've done so much to inform people, especially in this shifting landscape, in this shifting media landscape, where people are now looking more to social media to find out what's happening. You are that trusted voice that is keeping people informed. And I'm so happy to have you here because similarly, with my newsletter, I'm keeping people informed on news affecting ethnic minorities, on Black, Asian, and Arab communities. And I know that there's so much that goes on here that also is similar to what's going on in America. And I just wanted to basically start off by saying, okay, so those of you who don't know Phil, Philip Lewis, I call you Phil because that's your Twitter handle. Is that okay?
Yeah, Phil is fine, yeah.
So Phil is deputy editor at the Huffington Post, and he is the president of the Washington Black Journalists Association. Is that right?
Yeah, the Washington Association of Black Journalists. Yep, here in DC.
Association of Black Journalists. And also he is the founder of the newsletter, which is on Substack, What I'm Reading by Phil Lewis. So that is an award-winning newsletter. And basically that newsletter summarizes and recaps all the news that is affecting the Black community in America. And yeah, Phil, if you just want to explain what made you decide to launch your newsletter?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for that really great introduction. I just need you to come around just all the time and just give me that introduction. No, so the newsletter, I really was inspired by two things. So the main thing was Elon taking over Twitter, right? People reach out to me and were like, hey, we really rely on you as a news source on social media. So if at the time we didn't know what was going to happen with Twitter, we're just like, okay, Elon has bought it, so now what? So I created it as a way for people to be able to keep up with me and keep up with the stories that I share. Because I think Elon taking over Twitter really sort of, and it wasn't the beginning of it, but it really exposed how prevalent disinformation and misinformation are. As you know now, if you're on X, we should be saying X. On X now, it's like it's a whole new sort of like landscape to where I was actually searching for stories about the wildfires in California, and I used to be able to search on X and find information I needed. I could find people who were impacted. Now I have to sift through just tons of just garbage and blue check marks and just misinformation to get to what I used to go to. So Elon Musk has ruined a perfectly decent source of news for a lot of people. And so I created the newsletter as an attempt to combat that, specifically for the Black community, because I feel like our community in particular is targeted by disinformation, as we've seen through the election with a lot of the things that were happening during the election with Kamala Harris and disinformation that targeted her campaign. So that was one of the main reasons that I created it, was because of Elon taking over Twitter. And then the second reason was just, I really think that as a journalist, I think that it's important for us to kind of have our own, I know it's kind of not great to say, but we should have kind of our own brand. We should have our own things happening for us as independent creators outside of newsrooms, just because we can be laid off like that. We can be laid off like that. The media landscape is changing so much. And like you were just saying, people are moving away from trusting, I guess you could say, outlets, newsroom, like traditional newsroom outlets, traditional news outlets, and they're more interested in news creators, right? Or journalists, or even content creators, right? Or what have you, whatever you want to term it. And so those were the two main reasons: Elon taking over Twitter, and the search to sort of create my own sort of independent platform where people can find out news from me.
I love how you're straight to the point about Elon Musk and the Twitter takeover, because I think over here it's something that we've been quite coy about really discussing and really sort of acknowledging what a huge shift it is. I feel like it's only recently, as of last year, that people started to really acknowledge, like, okay, this takeover means something. I think for us, it was probably the general election that we had over here, and the new emerging party Reform with Nigel Farage. I think that's when people started to pay attention to what was going on with the takeover by Elon Musk. But yeah, and when you mentioned that Black people, the Black community is targeted by this disinformation and misinformation, we saw that with COVID. I told so many, lies about the vaccine, essentially putting people off of even being vaccinated, and here, Black people and Asian people disproportionately died from COVID. And I do believe that misinformation and disinformation, it played a part. And it's scary to say, isn't it? It's dangerous at this point, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I would say so. I think it's the same for us. I mean, so COVID, the COVID misinformation was rampant, right? I mean, there were entire campaigns done by our government to try to combat that. But I think the thing about taking over Twitter is this, in my opinion, Twitter is the most influential platform for news, and it's like that because I know it may seem like TikTok, Instagram, all these other platforms are more influential, but really what I've seen is that people generally crib and take information from Twitter and just repurpose it for TikTok. So technically all of the information, and I think this is what Elon realized, and then my fears kind of were confirmed by that when he took it over, and we could see this through the election, because a lot of people who would be considered to be thinkers, right, or thought leaders, officials, influencers are generally on Twitter. And so when you are able to kind of control that platform, you really are able to control the narrative. And so taking over that platform really influenced people's ideas, people's thoughts, and not just taking over the platform, but also changing the algorithm so that now we see, I can go on Twitter and I can see 15 posts from, I don't know, insert right-wing creator here before I see one post from, I don't know, a traditional media outlet. Like I generally, and I'm on Twitter a lot, I generally don't see posts from like Reuters or the New York Times or even the Independent, right? Or the Telegraph, right? Like I don't see those posts. I will see more posts from these random accounts, sometimes faceless accounts, who know how to game the system on Twitter. And so that really makes it like Twitter is like it's like the fountain, and then everywhere else kind of follows it. So that's really kind of the issue that we're having today with the misinformation. Disinformation all pretty much flows from X. Elon Musk doesn't need
a news outlet. He is the news essentially.
He is the media. That's what he says. He says you are the media now, right? And what that means is it's two things. It's a call to all of these, I don't even know what to call them, like these creators online who know that if we can share it, well, first of all, if we buy a blue check, we can share information. Our information, our whatever we share will be boosted automatically to your For You page, or will be the first thing you'll see in your search. And it doesn't matter if it's true or not, right? Like we can get paid off of your outrage. We can get paid off of spreading lies, spreading misinformation. And so when he says you are the media now, it's really a call to it's really a call to those sorts of folks, but it's also a warning to journalists like you and I, who are trying to fight this, right? We're trying to fight this, but he's saying like, okay, well, what you all are doing is not important, but we, you know, as you and I know, proper journalism is more important now than ever.
Absolutely. And, you know, obviously we see that there are a lot of these right-wing blue check accounts that are just spreading misinformation all over. But there are people like you who, I mean, you have a massive following. I believe you have over 400,000 followers on Twitter, and they trust you. So you've kind of been able to game the system for good, for good, in order to actually combat the misinformation that's out there. And sometimes when, I don't know if you have this, because I mean, your following is huge. Mine is 13,000. And even with 13,000 followers, when I tweet a summary of the news, I'm literally reading it over and over and over and over again. And I'm like, did I read that correctly? I need to read it again. Like, did that actually happen? I'm going to double check. And you read it, you comb through it, because it's so important that you get the facts right, because you don't want to mislead people. You don't want to spread misinformation. When you have over 400,000 followers, when you're tweeting, have you just become so used to it now that, you know, you'll just tweet and you know your tweets go viral? So you know the impact of getting it right and getting it wrong. What is that process like for you when you go through, you find a story that you want to share and you're about to tweet it? Are you somewhat nervous about doing that, or has that worn off over time?
Oh, so that's a great question. I think what because you're right. Like I have sort of been able to sort of game the system, but I will say that that comes as a result of doing this for a decade. Like I've been on Twitter since really for a long time, but in a professional sense since 2015. So during Trump's ascent, right? During his ascent, and also during sort of the height of, I guess you could say, Black Lives Matter. And so I have a built-in trust from with people and with the audience. But there's a couple of things about that. I think it's important for people to understand that, and this is where the plot has been lost. People don't understand that journalists are also human and make mistakes. And so when we do make mistakes, what really shows the mark of a proper journalist is that we are open about it and we're transparent and we make corrections. And these are things that I think people tend to think if a journalist gets something wrong, then it was for some malevolent reason, right? Like we did it because we hate the source or whatever, right? Which is I would say, to be fair, is generally not true. And I would also say that we're all susceptible to misinformation and disinformation. Like we're all susceptible to it. But what I try to do is if I'm sharing a story, I'm not as nervous as I used to be when I first started doing it. But I will say, whenever I am sharing a story, I always try to go back and see two things. A couple things. Who is sharing the story? So what outlet? When it was shared, because more often than not, somebody's sharing on an old story. And also, I always try to find the original source. So a lot of reporting these days is really just aggregation, or for people who are not familiar, it's aggregation is when you are cribbing a story from another outlet, right? So if somebody, I try to find the original source for that article, because I want to see the entire context. If you are aggregating a story, sometimes people leave out important details. So usually, I generally don't share stories that are aggregated from somewhere else unless I have a problem with the original source, or unless there's something off. So usually that helps me, because whenever I go back to the original story and I can see the full context, I'm like, oh, okay, maybe this outlet has a spicy headline, right? Or a headline that's much more capable of going viral online, right? But they are missing context. So I'm usually looking at those sorts of things before I'm sharing anything.
Yeah, I think like because I've been doing something similar, obviously, with sharing stories, and it really gives you a good insight into how news outlets really choose their headlines and what narrative
Mm.
they want to put out there, doesn't it? Because, like you
Yeah.
say, when you go to the original source, you go, well, hold on a minute. There's something much more important here that they haven't included in this new article. And also, sometimes when they do get it wrong, you do see it. And sometimes you see the correction, well, sometimes they don't make explicit corrections. Sometimes
Yeah.
it just gets updated and the story moves on. And you see this
Well,
happen.
that's the thing about I mean that's the thing about having all of these digital outlets. Like one original source can have one thing, but every other outlet, like I'm going to go back to the UK. The Independent can have a much different headline from like the Sunday Times, right? Or I don't know, or the Telegraph or whomever. Like all of these outlets can come. There can be one original source, but every outlet can have a different take
Mm,
on what the source was, and so that I think that sort of confuses people too.
yeah. But I think when you choose to share Black news, because I mean, living in the UK, we only have one Black newspaper. There is only one in the entire UK. So most of mainstream media is not geared towards Black news. It's not told from
Mm-hmm.
that lens. It's just told from a very general lens. But what I find is that by reading certain stories, you do actually pick out. So for example, with deaths in maternity care, you know, Black women have higher rates of dying in the UK. But when there's a general story about death in maternity care, sometimes you see that right at the end, or sometimes it's not even mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the sorts of things that you pick out, or you look for, or you go back to the report, the official report, and then you see, okay, so they did mention it, but in the story on the mainstream, it's not in there. So it is very interesting. And with the stories you share, are you picking those details out, or do you have more news that is geared towards Black people?
Yeah, so the the example you just gave, I think, is why newsletters like yours and newsletters like mine are really key. Because there's so much news that I think people are just generally just checked out. They're just like, oh, this is just too much. And sometimes people just kind of want to know, like, okay, well, what are the things that I really should be paying attention to? And so for that is the purpose of my newsletter.
Mm,
I think so. In America, we have several Black
mm,
owned outlets, but we are we're a very vocal and sort of large minority, and our Black owned news outlets are not always funded properly to be able to to take up the task of covering such a broad and really diverse. I mean, the Black community in America is really diverse
mm,
community of people, and so when I'm sort of curating my newsletter, I have a across America section so that I pull stories that are happening locally, from Delaware to California to Arizona to even Massachusetts, right? Or like in predominantly white states. But what I want people to know about the newsletter and the stories that I pick out is that I always try to make sure that these are stories that people need to know about, and are useful for them, that they might not see in online. Because I think if you're only getting your news from Instagram or like TikTok or whatever, then you are siloed in a way that is detrimental. Like you're only seeing what the algorithm wants you to see,
mm,
and you and I, we don't use AI or algorithm to
yeah.
create the stories that we're looking for. So I think there's something to be said about that human sort of touch, where we're looking for stories and we're able to pick out the important parts of like a New York Times story that is about maternal mortality. Okay, and at the end they say, oh, and also Black women suffer the most. Like
When that
for
should
these
be the
newsletters?
headline.
Yeah, exactly, right. So so when I'm reading these stories, I'm like, okay, what is the most important part that people for this newsletter in particular need to know about?
Yeah, I mean, that's so key. That's so important. And like you say, if people are only getting their news from Twitter, which now, I mean, we're not even finding anything as journalists, let alone people who are just on the platform. If you're looking on Twitter, if you're looking on TikTok, if you're looking on Instagram, it's chosen for you. So I think that is another challenge, really, is that people are missing out on so much because it is chosen for them, and they're not staying informed, and they have no idea really of everything that's going on out there. And I know in your newsletter you often write, Black news is shrinking. Why do you think it's shrinking? Why do you say it's shrinking?
So let's see. I think it really is just the monetary sort of thing. A lot of newsrooms aren't able to, like I said, a lot of newsrooms aren't able to keep up with the sort of just whims of just what's happening here, like from an economic standpoint. Newsrooms, so the black press, for example, has been a key part of America, from Ida B. Wells to places like the Michigan Chronicle or the Chicago Defender. Like, these newspapers have been around for a long time, for 100 years, but they're not able to. A lot of them aren't able to grow in ways like in ways that their peers have been able to, like their white peers have been able to. And so I think Black news in particular is just always under attack, because we always have to explain to people why it's important, especially when you have this backlash against DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, and we're always, even the other day, I had to, when I wrote the story about the Black community in Altadena, California, that was impacted by the fires. Someone responded to me and was like, okay, well, everybody was impacted. Why do you care about just like the Black folks? And I always have to explain to people that white news is the mainstream. Like, if I want a story about the white people who've been impacted by any calamity in America, I just have to click on. I can go to the New York Times and find that out in an instant. I can find that instantly. So but the reverse is not generally true. Like, we just do not have the same sort of resources from a news gathering and news just impact. We don't have the same sort of we don't have the same sort of things and resources available to us when it comes to news impacting the Black community. So I think that's just important to note. Like, I think that there are forces that don't want Black news to be shared and for people to know what's going on. And I just try to always keep that forefront of mind, like for my newsletter, which is free. I understand why paywalls are around, but I want people to be able to read it and access information, because people in our community are not necessarily looking to pay for news, which, like, I understand, but I just want to read it.
No, yeah. I get that. And even for me personally, my newsletter was free, and then I decided to put a paywall up, but I still give part of it so that people are able to read it. But the reasons why I wanted to put a paywall up is because, like you say, a lot of like Black-owned news outlets or magazines or wherever it might be are under-resourced and underfunded. They don't have the money to be able to go out there and report on everything. And especially over here, I really think that there's a need to have Black opinion writers to share their views, to counter sort of what's going on, and just to be heard in general. So I decided to make mine a paid for newsletter in order to be able to commission writers to write for the newsletter, and just to create that opportunity. Because I think that what else is missing from the media is Black journalists as well, because you have to admit that there is a difference between a Black journalist coming into the media and a white journalist coming in. Black journalists, not all, but some might care to go and tell those stories from the Black community to really uncover the truths that lie there. So you need more. But if they don't have the opportunity, especially as you say now, DEI is being demonized, and they're trying to get rid of it. You know, Meta recently announced that they were ending their DEI efforts. I think Amazon has said they're ending some, but they're continuing. I won't say they're completely ended, but I
Yeah.
was informed that they are continuing.
Mm.
So yeah, it's under attack, and without those Black journalists and without the opportunities to write, then you'd probably see more news.
So I think I think what one of the main issues is we have done a really poor job of explaining to the public, whether that's here in the U.S. or in the U.K. We've done a really poor job of explaining to the public and also Black communities why this news is important, why you should pay for it. Journalism is a trade, you know, and people should be paid and compensated for their work. And I mean, it's a field that where we are disproportionately underfunded. But I think because of the rise of social media, and people are like, okay, well, why would I pay for this if I can just get it for free or in my own Instagram account? Like I can just look at a post and it tells me what's going on. And I just keep moving. They don't know why it's important to support the journalists who made it possible for you to be able to look on Instagram and see that news. That there's a disconnect there. And I'm not sure how we are able to entice and kind of get people to understand why journalism is important, because you are benefiting from it by seeing what you see on social media, when in reality those accounts and pages that you enjoy so much are taking that information from journalists who made the phone calls, who went into the fires and talked to different people. So there's a disconnect where people don't understand why this is important to pay for.
Yeah, there really is a disconnect, and like you say, it's hard to explain. But I hope that through this conversation, people can understand. And like you mentioned at the beginning, with Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter and all the misinformation that we're seeing on there, and especially even with Facebook, I was thinking about this the other day, how they're getting rid of their fact checking team. So now they're not going to check the facts on any posts, and they're getting rid of their diversity goals. So what does that leave then? In my view, it leaves a whole load of misinformation and racism, which I don't know how society can really thrive in that. I think it will see the downfall of society. I really think that this is going to create more division. This is going to create more harm to minorities, especially. And that's the thing. I think that people don't realize that because everybody is only listening to the misinformation that's out there and ignoring the real news that's out there, everyone's essentially getting brainwashed. And it's the downfall. It's the downfall of society, because journalism is a pillar of society, you know. It upholds it, and it holds people to account. So I think people take that for granted. And like you mentioned with the accounts that we see on social media, in America, obviously there are accounts that are more popular than others. But what do you think they get right that maybe the media doesn't, in order to attract people and engage them?
I think that's a great question, because I mean I think if you ask like most people, they're like, oh well, you know, I get my news from online, social media. I look at, you know, if I look at TikTok and my favorite TikToker is talking about this thing, then that's how I learn about it. Or if I go on Instagram and I see a news adjacent account sharing, or like an entertainment blog or whatever, sharing a story that I find interesting, then that's how I find out. I think I think what people enjoy most about those sorts of accounts is that they are pretty authentic. They don't, and that cuts both ways, because those accounts, they're authentic, but also they are not necessarily aware of like what goes into being following journalism tenets, right? Like following journalism like regulations, I guess you could say ethics, right?
Yeah.
So there's an authenticity with these accounts that draws people in. They're pretty simple, right? Like they kind of explain what's happening in a very clear way, uh, and you don't necessarily need to read 10 blocks of text to get to know, okay, what happened? This happened like right now. Yes. Okay, cool. I can keep scrolling. And also generally they're free, like they're accessible. Like if I want to know, what's going on with my favorite rapper or something, I just go on my phone and look on Instagram and see what's going on my favorite Instagram account or social media account. So those are things that I think media in general has really, well, newsrooms have really kind of lagged behind. And then also there's just this shift culturally where people are not as interested in what, I don't know, the Washington Post or the New York Times has to say, and they're way more interested in what my favorite TikToker or what my favorite news creator has to say. That's a cultural shift or societal shift that I think we have to really sort of consider and think about.
Well, obviously Instagram, TikTok, those sort of pages where either somebody's talking at you or it's just a picture. But you, obviously with Twitter, you've been able to sort of do the same thing in a way, haven't you? Because
Yep.
I think a lot of people might not necessarily click on the story that you've shared, but they've taken away what you've told them. And it's a nice, neat, summary of what the story is about. So you are winning in that way. But obviously, Trump is coming to office in a matter of days. Where do you see the future of Black media, of Black stories being told, whether it's on Twitter, whether it's on a traditional news site? Where do you see that going moving forward?
I think we are in the age of the news influencer, right, or news creator, or whatever term you want to, I guess, give these individuals who are not necessarily journalists, but are doing journalistic sort of work. They're doing the work of informing people. And so I think newsrooms are scrambling to figure out how to deal with this, right? So like the Washington Post, for example, they laid off their entire PR team, and they are shifting more towards finding out how they can work with influencers and people like that to get their stories in front of people to see, and like the stories get eyes on their stories. So there's something happening, and I think with Trump's return to the White House, I think our stories are more important than ever, and we have to find ways to get these stories in front of people. So that's with newsletters like yours. That's with newsletters like mine, and we have to find ways to evolve, right? So if that's doing a podcast, if that's making an Instagram account, and doing that, we have to find ways to adapt and get people to read these stories. Because what I've noticed about just journalism at large is that it's not that people aren't interested in journalism. It's usually just how people are receiving it that we have to kind of figure out how to work our way around that. So like journalism is not going anywhere. Like people say journalism is dying. Journalism isn't dying. What's dying is the sort of methods that may have not worked for some time, and people are going to have to adapt, and so that's what we need to do.
And what's the future of your newsletter? I mean, where do you want it to go? Are you happy for it to remain a newsletter? Do you see it evolving into a news outlet? What do you have planned for your newsletter?
Well, so I use my newsletter really as an experimental sort of tool. Like I have tried the podcasting with it, which performed well. But I'm like a words person. Like I do like writing and recording, So I'm really just trying to figure out ways, like maybe I can collaborate with some of these Instagram accounts that you were talking about. Some of them do share my stories when I have scoops. You know, I've partnered with other outlets to get them to share my stories, to put them in front of their audiences. So I'm just experimenting with different things, seeing what works. Thankfully, I'm able to put my stories in front of people just because I've been able to build this sort of audience. But yeah, I mean, I think what makes sense for this newsletter is to also try to work with um, people, like-minded people who are in the news adjacent sort of space, and um, these news creators. I think that we shouldn't look at, as journalists, we shouldn't look at them as adversaries, because they are people with audiences who generally want to share and do the work of sharing our stories with audiences. So they're not adversaries. I don't think there's like a
Mm.
I don't think there's a fight in that way. I think what really is important is making sure that we can collaborate. Like if we can work together, I think that's a better path forward than trying to fight. Um, yeah, I would say so. I think that's what I'm trying to do.
Okay. And you know what? Like, I think it's so vital to have your newsletter, obviously, because even thinking back to the last couple of weeks with the fires in LA, and I remember, well, first of all, with this story, obviously, it's a devastating situation that's occurred.
Mm.
So many people have lost their homes, their lives, really, because they have nowhere to go after this. But obviously, in the press over here, and
Mm.
similarly in America, it was mainly focused on celebrities, you know,
Yes,
these
right.
are white celebrities. And it had me thinking, like, nobody else lives in this area, no, you
Mm.
know,
Right.
there are no regular residents. So when I saw that you had spoken to the Black residents in that area, I was like, it really hit me, because it was like, this just goes to show you uh, the contrast that there is between caring about white celebrities. It's such a way that this is being reported. The list of celebrities whose houses were burnt down, you know, in tragic circumstances, and the smidgen of reporting that there is on regular residents who are Black or Latino, who nobody's even, you know, heard or seen their faces on the news. And it's so vital that journalists like you are going and speaking to these people, because you know that they exist, you know,
Yeah.
and people don't if you're not going there and doing that, then people don't know they exist either. So it's so important what you do. It's a tragic
Mm.
shame that's the situation we're in, but it's unfortunately somebody has to do the work of telling those stories, otherwise they never get heard.
And so, what's interesting about that is that social media actually, I would say, still works in a lot of ways, because it the pressure that people on social media put on outlets to cover
Mm,
um, the Black community of Altadena
mm,
and Pasadena. Uh, I saw several viral tweets about, like, hey, here, social media for us has always been a microphone where we're able to
mm,
kind of tell people, like, hey, we exist, we're here, we are, this is what's happening.
mm,
And so that pressure from people like myself, people like Yesha Callahan, who wrote I believe the first story. She was the first person I saw who wrote about it for BET.
mm,
She wrote about the fires, just an explainer about the community,
mm,
and then from there, from there, all of the outlets like the LA Times, the New York Times, Reuters, all of these different outlets followed up, followed up and wrote about, like, hey, this is what's going on. So now if you Google search Altadena and you Google search
mm,
all of these and find these stories, you'll see all of these different stories. And don't get me wrong, they're very well written stories, but I think people can still use social media to pressure newsrooms into covering stories that are about communities that don't look like their newsroom, right? Like that don't look like the journalists, which are still to this day predominantly white, and not just white, but also come from a class background that is completely opposite of most of America.
Mm-hmm. But they shouldn't have to be pressured, should they? It shouldn't
Right.
be a thing of, oh, now people are putting heat on us that we have to cover this story, or, oh, Phil's covered this story, BET has covered this story. We don't want to miss out. Let's cover this
Yeah.
story now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes it does feel like that, doesn't it? That it's just
Mhm.
out of envy, almost like, oh, well, we want to look like we've done it all because we've covered mostly everything. So let's just add this into the the trolley and look like we're doing an amazing job. It's a really sad state of affairs, but I think it underscores exactly why it's important to support people like you and to support Black journalists and to share Black journalist stories and to share stories about, you know, Black people in general. I think what you're doing is absolutely fantastic. And yeah, it's been a pleasure to have you here. I know, lastly, before we go, you didn't even study journalism, did you? You came into this, you were studying sociology, weren't you?
Yeah, correct. Yes, that's right. I was a sociology major, and I actually used to teach. I taught fifth grade and seventh grade in Detroit, my hometown. But yeah, I really sort of fell into journalism. But I always tell people, journalism really is, it's a trade, right? Like, it's something that can be learned. There are I learned how to be a journalist on the job. Like, I learned through my intern, through my fellowship, and just building upon that and building upon that. So it's a trade. It's something that can be taught and can be learned.
Mm. And what would you say, like, after all this time, what's been the proudest story you've ever written?
Oh my goodness, uh that's tough. Like, that's actually pretty hard, because I'm really proud of a lot of the work
Mm.
I've been able to do. Um,
Or
so
the
I'm
story
gonna
that, Mhm.
I'm just gonna say, for now, I'm gonna just go with the most recent story about Altadena, just because I was able to really talk to some really resilient and amazing people, and I learned about a community that I didn't know about. I'm on the other side of the country, so I don't know a whole lot about California, but I was able to talk with people who were explaining to me about this really interesting community, of Altadena, which, was one of the very was one of the first places where Black folk could move and live and buy and purchase property, after moving from the South during the Great Migration. So learning about this area that really produced some really radical thinkers, poets, entertainers, all of this it was really interesting to learn about. So I'm proud of that story, and I'm proud of how people received it. And it also helped get people funds, right? Like, people who were looking
Mm.
for fundraising to help rebuild their homes. It helped with that as well. So I'm very proud of that story.
Yeah, and so you should be. Honestly, when I saw that, I was touched because, yeah, especially just seeing how little coverage those people were given compared to everybody else. You did that, and I think everybody needs, if they haven't already followed you on Twitter, on Instagram, you're on TikTok as well, aren't you?
I've been banned from TikTok, so I'm not on TikTok.
I'm sorry, you've been
No,
banned.
it's okay. Yeah, I've never been able to keep up with all of the terms. There's a bunch of terms you can and can't say on there. So, and that's
Oh,
just not,
really?
yeah, I just don't know. I never, like, for example, you can't say suicide. You have to say, like, unalive,
Oh,
and
yeah.
stuff like that. And I just can't keep up with that.
Yeah, it
Hmm.
would make it strange to report, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it's to me, it's somewhat journalistic in that way. So it's kind of hard for me to keep up with it, and it's a whole nother thing that I have to worry about. I'm okay.
Okay. Well, apparently
Yeah,
it's going to be banned soon, so you might
yeah,
not
I
have
have
to
no
worry
idea.
about it at all. But yeah, everyone should follow you on Twitter and sign up to what I'm reading on Substack. Is there any other way people can support you? You know, you can also pay for Phil's newsletter. monthly, annually, subscribe, support Phil, support his amazing work that he's doing. And yeah, if there's any other way people can support you, please shout out now. This is your time.
No, I mean, that was it. I really just, I encourage people to support newsletters like yours and newsletters like mine, just because we really do need it. And it is helpful to know that people are reading and just trying to stay informed, because I think there's so many forces out there that do not want you to be informed. And if there's a newsletter out there that's like, okay, for $5, I will let you know what's happening, let you know what's going on. There's time and effort that goes into that. So I would say, please support those sorts of newsletters.
Would you say that's your greatest concern right now, that moving forward with with Trump coming back, would you say your greatest concern is that there are people who do not want the people in the Black community to be informed?
Yeah, I think that's a really big concern, because I think a community that's not informed will just allow anything to happen, right? We'll just whatever people can get away with, they absolutely will. And I just say, like, let's not let people just all over, and do things without at least knowing what's happening, and keeping ourselves aware and abreast of like what's happening in our own community.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Phil. I'm going to end the recording.